Tatanka had sworn on the sacred bones of his ancestors that his family would never know chains. But when he crested that ridge and saw his wife Sakari and son Nodin standing barefoot on wooden blocks with price tags hanging from their necks, he knew the white man's greed had finally found its way into his sacred world. The blood debt that followed would paint the frontier red for generations to come. The morning mist clung to the black hills like the breath of sleeping spirits. But Tatanka felt no peace in the sacred landscape as he rode hard through the canyon passes. His warhorse, a magnificent paint stallion named Wikapi, had been running for 3 days straight, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. But the beast seemed to understand the urgency that drove his master forward. The message had reached Tatanka's hunting party through a network of tribal runners, each word carried like a burning arrow across the vast Dakota territory.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Come fast, the blue coats are selling your blood. The words had been spoken by. Standing there, an old Lakota scout who worked sometimes for the cavalry, his weathered face grave with the weight of terrible knowledge. Tatanka had been leading a buffalo hunt 200 miles north when the runner found them, his small band of warriors tracking a herd that would feed their people through the harsh winter ahead. But buffalo meant nothing when family was in danger. And Tatanka had left his hunting party without a word, riding south toward Fort Laramie with the fury of a prairie fire in his heart. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when Tatanka reached the trading grounds outside. The fort, a sprawling collection of makeshift structures where soldiers, traders, and desperate settlers gathered to exchange goods, information, and sometimes things that should never be bought or sold. The smell hit him first, a mixture of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and something else. Something that made his warrior's instincts scream warnings. It was the scent of fear and degradation that hung over places where human dignity went to die. Tatanka dismounted behind a stand of cottonwoods, his moccasins silent on the packed earth as he moved through the shadows toward the central trading area. His hand instinctively went to the war club at his belt, a weapon his grandfather had carried in the old battles against the Crow and Pawnee. Its head carved from sacred stone and wrapped in the hide of his first kill. But this enemy was different, more insidious than any warrior he had faced in honest combat. These were men who wore the masks of civilization while their hearts beat with the rhythm of predators. The trading post sat in the center of the compound, like a spider in its web, a low wooden building with windows that reflected the dying light like dead eyes. Around it, canvas tents formed irregular circles, each one housing different types of commerce, some legitimate, others whispered about in the darkness when decent people had turned away. Tatanka moved carefully between the structures, his trained eyes taking in every detail, every face, every weapon, cataloging threats and escape routes with the precision of a warrior who had survived countless battles. But nothing could have prepared him for what he saw when he rounded the corner of the largest tent. The auction block stood in the center of a cleared area, a crude platform built from rough-hewn timber and stained with the sweat and tears of countless victims. Wooden posts rose from each corner, connected by ropes that could restrain the most desperate struggles. And at the base of the platform, a small crowd of buyers gathered like vultures around carrion. They were a mixed group, cavalry officers in blue uniforms, civilian traders in dusty suits, and rough frontiersmen whose eyes held the cold calculation of men who saw profit in human misery. And there, standing on the platform under the harsh afternoon sun, were the two people who meant more to Tatanka than his own life. Sakari stood with her head held high despite the rope that bound her wrists, her long black hair flowing like a dark river over her shoulders, her traditional dress torn and dirty but unable to diminish her natural grace. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a respected medicine man, and she had chosen to marry Tatanka when she could have had any warrior in the tribe. Her dark eyes swept the crowd with unconcealed contempt, and even in chains, she radiated. The quiet strength that had first captured Tatanka's heart 7 years ago. Beside her stood Nodin, barely 8 years old, his small frame trembling not with fear but with the rage he had inherited from his father. The boy's eyes were wide, with confusion and anger, his jaw set in the same stubborn line that Tatanka recognized from his own reflection. Nodin wore the simple clothes of a Lakota child, leather leggings and a cotton shirt, but his feet were bare and dirty, and there were marks on his wrists where ropes had chafed his tender skin. Each of them bore a crude wooden tag tied around their necks with hemp rope, the kind used to mark livestock for sale. Sakari's tag read $50 in black paint, while Nodin's bore the price $25, as if the life of a warrior's son could be measured in silver coins. The sight of those tags, hanging from the necks of his beloved family like cattle brands, sent a wave of fury through Tatanka's body so intense that his vision blurred and his hands began to shake. The auctioneer was a thin man with pale skin and nervous eyes, his voice carrying across the compound as he extolled the virtues of his human merchandise. Now folks, I know what you're thinking. What use is a squaw and her half-breed boy to civilized people? But hear me out. This woman knows herbs and healing, can cook, can sew, and she's young enough to bear more children if that's what you're wanting. The boy's strong for his age, smart too, and he'll work hard if you train him right. The crowd chuckled at the auctioneer's words, but Tatanka heard something else in their laughter, a hunger that went beyond mere commerce. These men weren't just buying servants or laborers. They were purchasing the right to dominate, to control, to break the spirits of proud people who had once ruled this land. The realization hit him like a physical blow, that his wife and son were being reduced to objects, their worth measured in dollars rather than the love and respect they deserved. A fat man in a cavalry uniform stepped forward, his blue coat straining. Over his belly, brass buttons catching the light like coins. "I'll give you 30 for the woman," he called out, his voice slurred with drink. "Don't need the boy. Already got enough mouths to feed at the fort." The casual way he dismissed Nodin's life, as if the child was nothing more than an inconvenience, made Tatanka's blood boil with the heat of 1,000 suns. But it was Sakari's reaction that truly broke his heart. For just a moment, her composed mask slipped, and he saw the terror in her eyes, not for herself but for their son. She stepped slightly in front of Nodin, her bound hands reaching back to touch his shoulder, and in that gesture Tatanka saw all the love and desperate protection of a mother who would die before letting harm come to her child. The auctioneer shook his head at the cavalry officer's bid. "Now come on, Captain Morrison, you know they're worth more than that. Look at this woman. She's got years of good work left in her, and the boy will grow into a strong worker if you treat him right. I'm looking for at least 40 for the woman, 20 for the boy, and I'll throw in a bill of sale that'll make it all legal and proper." Legal and proper. The words echoed in Tatanka's mind like a death chant, the idea that there could be anything legal about selling his family, anything proper about reducing human beings to chattel. He thought of the treaties his people had signed, the promises of protection and respect that had been broken so many times they had become meaningless, and he understood with crystal clarity that the white man's law was nothing more than a tool to justify whatever cruelty they wished to inflict. A second bidder emerged from the crowd, a civilian trader in a black suit, who looked like he had never missed a meal in his life. 40 for the woman, but I don't want the boy," he said, his voice smooth as snake oil. "I run a boarding house down in Denver, and I need someone who can cook and clean and keep the customers happy, if you know what I mean." The implications of his words sent a chill through Tatanka's soul, and he saw Sakari's face go pale with understanding. 50 for both, called out a third voice, and Tatanka's blood turned to ice as he recognized the speaker. It was Lieutenant James Crawford, a young officer who had visited their village many times under the pretense of maintaining peaceful relations.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Crawford had always been polite, even friendly, sharing meals with Tatanka's family and playing simple games with Nodin. The betrayal was complete and devastating. That someone they had trusted, someone they had welcomed into their home, was now attempting to purchase them like livestock. The auctioneer's eyes lit up with greed. Now we're talking sense. 50 for the pair. That's a fair price for quality merchandise. Do I hear 55? But before anyone could respond, Sakari did something that made Tatanka's heart swell with pride and terror in equal measure. She spat directly in Crawford's face, her saliva striking his cheek like a physical blow. "You are no warrior," she said in clear English, her voice carrying across the crowd like a war cry. "You are a snake who crawls on his belly and feeds on the trust of children. My husband will come for you, and when he does, you will know what it means to face a true Lakota warrior." The crowd murmured at her defiance, some laughing, others looking uncomfortable at the raw dignity and courage she displayed even in chains. Crawford wiped his face with a handkerchief, his cheeks flushing red with embarrassment and anger. "Spirited, I'll give you that," he said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "But spirit can be broken, and I've got just the methods to do it. $55 for both, and I'll take delivery right now." The casual way he spoke of breaking Sakari's spirit, as if it were nothing more than training a stubborn horse, made Tatanka reach for his war club, but before he could act, movement in the crowd caught his eye. There, standing among the buyers, with rifles across their knees, were faces he recognized. Sergeant William Hayes, who had negotiated the last treaty with their tribe. Corporal David Lynch, who had shared tobacco with Tatanka's father just last month. Even old Tom Brennan, the trader who had always dealt fairly with their people, selling them guns and ammunition in exchange for furs and buffalo hides. The betrayal went deeper than he had imagined. This wasn't just a few corrupt soldiers or greedy civilians. This was a systematic operation that reached into the very heart of the military and civilian leadership in the territory. Men he had trusted, men his people had considered friends, were all part of a network that saw Native American families as nothing more than inventory to be bought and sold. Tatanka forced himself to step back into the shadows, his warriors, training overriding the rage that demanded immediate action. He was one man against dozens, and charging in now would only result in his own death and leave his family with no hope of rescue. But as he watched the bidding continue, as he saw Crawford's smug face and heard the casual discussion of his wife's future degradation, he began to plan. The auction was winding down, with Crawford's bid of $55 standing unchallenged. The auctioneer was about to bring down his hammer when Sakari spoke again, her voice carrying a weight of prophecy that made even the hardened frontiersman shift uncomfortably. "You think you have won," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd with the intensity of a hunting eagle. "But you have awakened something that cannot be stopped. The spirits of our ancestors watch, and they will guide my husband's hand when he comes for his revenge." The hammer fell with a sound like thunder, and Crawford stepped forward to claim his human property. But as he approached the platform, Nodin did something that made Tatanka's heart nearly burst with pride and terror. The boy lunged forward, his small hands reaching for Crawford's throat, his young voice raised in a war cry that echoed across the compound like the scream of a diving hawk. Crawford backhanded the child across the face, sending him sprawling to the platform's rough boards, blood streaming from his nose. "That's the last time you'll raise your hand to a white man, boy," he snarled, his mask of civilized behavior finally slipping to reveal the brutal reality beneath. "I'll teach you respect if it's the last thing I do." That was the moment when Tatanka's control finally snapped. The sight of his son's blood, the sound of Crawford's threat, the knowledge that his family was about to disappear into a nightmare from which they might never return. It all coalesced into a rage so pure and focused that it felt like a physical force. He stepped out of the shadows, his war club in his hand, his voice raised in the ancient war cry of his people. The crowd turned in shock as the Lakota warrior emerged from concealment, his painted face terrible in the dying light, his muscled frame moving with the fluid grace of a predator. Some of the buyers reached for their weapons, but Tatanka was already moving, his years of training and warfare giving him speed and precision that civilized men could never match. He vaulted onto the platform in a single bound, his war club whistling through the air toward Crawford's skull. But the lieutenant was faster than expected, rolling aside as the stone head of the club splintered the wooden post where his head had been. The compound erupted in chaos as men shouted orders, drew weapons, and scattered for cover. Tatanka found himself surrounded by a dozen rifles, their barrels pointing at him like the fingers of death, but he stood his ground, his body positioned protectively between the soldiers and his family. "Stand down, warrior," shouted Captain Morrison, his own revolver drawn and cocked. "You're outnumbered 20 to 1, and if you don't surrender, we'll cut you down where you stand." But Tatanka's eyes were fixed on Crawford, who was climbing to his feet with murder in his expression, his hand moving toward the pistol at his hip. "You made a mistake coming here alone," Crawford said, his voice deadly calm. "But I'm glad you did. Now I can break you in front of your family, show them what happens to savages who think they can challenge civilized men." He drew his pistol with practiced ease, the metal gleaming in the fading light like a promise of death. Tatanka's mind raced through possibilities, calculating angles and distances, looking for any advantage that might save his family. He was a warrior, trained from childhood in the arts of war, but he was also vastly outnumbered and surrounded by enemies who had every advantage. The smart thing would be to surrender, to hope that he could find another way to save Sakari and Nodin. But his warrior's pride rebelled at the thought of submission. That's when he noticed the kerosene lamp hanging from the auctioneer's podium, its flame flickering in the evening breeze. A desperate plan began to form in his mind, one that would require perfect timing and no small amount of luck. He shifted his weight slightly, preparing to move, his eyes never leaving Crawford's face. "You want to see what a Lakota warrior can do?" Tatanka said, his voice carrying across the compound like distant thunder. "Then watch closely, because you're about to learn why your people fear us in the darkness." With those words, he hurled his war club not at Crawford, but at the kerosene lamp, the stone head shattering the glass and sending burning oil cascading across the wooden platform. The fire spread with shocking speed, fed by the dry wood and canvas that surrounded the trading post. Men screamed and scattered as flames licked at their feet, and in the chaos that followed, Tatanka moved like a shadow given form. He scooped up Nodin with one arm, cut Sakari's bonds with the knife from his belt, and plunged into the smoke and confusion that now filled the compound. Bullets whined past his head as he ran, carrying his son while Sakari kept pace beside him, her long legs carrying her with the grace of a deer fleeing wolves. The fire was spreading faster now, reaching the ammunition stored in some of the tents, and the sound of exploding cartridges added to the chaos that masked their escape. Behind them, Crawford's voice rose above the noise, screaming orders and threats that were lost in the roar of flames and the panic of men. They reached the cottonwoods where Tatanka had left his horse, and he lifted his family onto Wikapi's back before vaulting up behind them. The paint stallion needed no urging, his hooves drumming against the earth as he carried them away from the burning compound and into the safety of the gathering darkness. But as they rode, Tatanka's mind was already working ahead, planning what would come next, because this was only the beginning. The men who had put price tags on his wife and son, who had reduced his family to merchandise in their twisted marketplace, they would pay for their crimes. Every last one of them would learn what it meant to cross a Lakota warrior, and the territory would run red with the blood of those who thought they could buy and sell human souls. The fire behind them reached the main trading post, and the Building erupted in flames that painted the night sky orange and red. The sight filled Tatanka with grim satisfaction, but he knew it would take more than fire to cleanse the stain of what he had witnessed. Justice would require blood, and he was prepared to spill as much as necessary to protect his people from the monsters who wore the masks of civilization. As they rode through the darkness toward the safety of the tribal lands, Sakari reached back to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his war paint. "My husband," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the thunder of hooves. "What will you do now?" Tatanka's answer came without hesitation, spoken like a vow before the spirits of his ancestors. "I will hunt them all." The sacred cave of his ancestors had sheltered Tatanka's people for generations, but tonight it felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. Hidden deep in the Badlands where the cavalry dared not venture, the limestone cavern stretched back into darkness that seemed to swallow the flickering light of their small fire. Sakari sat with Nudin pressed against her side, both of them wrapped in buffalo robes that Tatanka had cached here years ago, but no amount of warmth could chase away the chill of what they had witnessed. Tatanka knelt before the fire, studying the papers he had taken from Crawford's saddlebags during their escape. The lieutenant had been carrying more than just money for his human purchases. There were detailed records, maps showing routes through the territory, and most damning of all, a ledger that revealed the true scope of the operation that had nearly claimed his family. Page after page of names, ages, tribal affiliations, and prices, documenting the sale of Native American families across a network that stretched from the Canadian border to the Rio Grande. The entries made his blood run cold. Spotted Hawk family, Cheyenne, mother and 3 children, sold to Denver mining operation for $200. 2 Crow boys, ages 10 and 12, delivered to Kansas cattle ranch, $75 each. Sioux woman, aged 18, purchased by St. Louis brothel owner, $100. Each line represented a family destroyed, children stolen from their homes, people reduced to nothing more than livestock in a marketplace that operated under the protection of the United States Army. But it was the signature page that revealed the true horror of what they faced. Colonel Marcus Whitman, commanding officer of Fort Laramie, had personally authorized dozens of these transactions. Major Theodore Blackwood of the Department of Indian Affairs had provided legal documentation that made the sales appear legitimate. Even Judge Harrison Pike of the Territorial Supreme Court had signed orders transferring custody of Native children to suitable Christian families, who had paid handsomely for the privilege. Sakari looked up from tending to Nodin's injuries, her eyes reflecting the firelight like dark stars. "How long has this been happening?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tatanka studied the dates in the ledger, his jaw tightening as he traced the entries back through time. 3 years, he said finally. Maybe longer. They've been stealing our people and selling them like horses, and we never knew because they made it look legal. The word tasted like poison in his mouth. The idea that there could be anything legal about the systematic enslavement of his people. Nodin stirred in his mother's arms, his young face still bearing the bruise from Crawford's blow. "Father," he said, his voice stronger than Tatanka expected, "when will you kill the bad men?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire. And Tatanka felt the weight of his son's expectation, the simple faith that justice would be served and wrongs would be made right. But the reality was far more complex than a child could understand, and the enemies they faced wore uniforms and hid behind laws that protected them from retribution. "Soon, my son," Tatanka said, reaching out to touch the boy's cheek. "But first, your father must be very careful. These men are not like the warriors we fight in honest battle. They are snakes who hide in tall grass, and if we charge at them like buffalo, they will slither away and strike us from behind." Nodin nodded solemnly, accepting his father's wisdom even as his young eyes burned with the desire for revenge that ran in their bloodline. Tatanka spent the rest of the night studying the ledger by firelight, memorizing every name, every location, every detail that might help him track down the men responsible for this nightmare. The network was vast and well organized, with agents in every major fort and trading post throughout the territory. They used legitimate military operations as cover, taking prisoners during raids and then selling them instead of returning them to their tribes. They exploited the legal system, using technicalities and false documentation to transfer ownership of human beings, as if they were cattle or horses. As dawn broke over the Badlands, painting the rock formations in shades of gold and crimson, Tatanka made his decision. He could not fight this enemy with traditional warfare, could not defeat them through direct confrontation. Instead, he would use their own methods against them, become a shadow that stalked them through their civilized world, picking them off one by one until they understood that there were consequences for treating his people like merchandise. His first target would be Crawford, the man who had tried to buy his family and struck his son. The lieutenant was stationed at Fort Robinson, a day's ride to the south, where he commanded a company of cavalry tasked with maintaining order among the local tribes. But Tatanka knew that Crawford's real mission was procurement, identifying families that could be taken and sold without causing too much trouble. The fort's records would show when Crawford was scheduled to leave on his next patrol, and that's when Tatanka would be waiting. He kissed Sakari and Nodin goodbye as the sun climbed higher, promising to return within 3 days. The paint stallion Wikapi had rested and grazed during the night, and he seemed eager to run again as Tatanka mounted and guided him out of the hidden canyon. The ride to Fort Robinson took them through some of the most beautiful country on earth, rolling grasslands that stretched to the horizon, but Tatanka saw none of its beauty. His mind was focused entirely on the hunt that lay ahead. Fort Robinson squatted on the prairie like a brown scar, its wooden palisade and adobe buildings arranged in neat military precision. Tatanka watched from a ridge 2 miles away, using an old cavalry spyglass he had taken from a dead soldier years before. The fort was busy with the usual activity of a military installation, soldiers drilling in the courtyard, supply wagons coming and going, horses being tended in the corrals. But Tatanka was looking for one specific man, and it took him most of the day to spot Crawford emerging from the officers' quarters. The lieutenant looked different in his crisp blue uniform, his hair neatly combed and his boots polished too. A mirror shine. It was hard to believe that this respectable-looking officer was the same man who had casually discussed breaking Sakari's spirit and had struck a child for daring to defend himself. But Tatanka had learned that evil often wore a pleasant face, that the most dangerous predators were those who looked like everyone else. That evening, Crawford left the fort with a small patrol, just as the ledger had indicated he would. Tatanka followed at a distance, his horse's hooves silent on the grass, his dark clothing making him nearly invisible in the gathering dusk. The patrol made camp by a small creek about 10 miles from the fort, posting sentries and settling in for the night with the casual confidence of men who believed themselves safe in their own territory. Tatanka waited until the moon was high before he moved. The sentries were stationed at the perimeter of the camp, their attention focused outward toward potential threats from hostile Indians, never suspecting that death was already among them. He slipped past the guards like a ghost, his years of training in the old ways serving him well as he approached Crawford's tent. The lieutenant was alone, as Tatanka had hoped, separated from his men by the privileges of rank. Crawford was writing in a journal when Tatanka entered the tent, his pen scratching across the paper in the yellow light of a small oil lamp. He looked up as the tent flap moved, expecting to see one of his subordinates, and his face went white with terror when he saw the Lakota warrior instead. He reached for the pistol beside his bedroll, but Tatanka was faster, his hand closing around Crawford's throat before the officer could draw his weapon. "You remember me," Tatanka said, his voice barely above a whisper. The savage whose family you tried to buy. The man whose son you struck. Crawford's eyes bulged as he struggled for air, his hands clawing at Tatanka's iron grip. But the warrior's strength was beyond anything the civilized man had ever encountered. "Please," Crawford gasped, "I was just following orders. I never meant any harm to your family." The words were exactly what Tatanka had expected. The same coward's excuse that men had used throughout history to justify their cruelty. "Following orders," Tatanka repeated, his grip tightening slightly. "Is that what you told the children you sold? That you were just following orders when you put price tags around their necks?" He reached into his belt and withdrew the knife his grandfather had given him, its blade gleaming in the lamplight. Crawford's eyes fixed on the weapon with the fascination of a rabbit watching a snake, understanding finally that his death had found him in this tent on the empty prairie. "Wait," Crawford whispered, his voice hoarse from Tatanka's grip. "I can help you. I know things, names, places where they're holding your people. I can tell you everything if you just let me live." Tatanka studied the man's face, seeing the desperation there, the willingness to betray his partners if it meant saving his own skin. It was useful information, but it didn't change what Crawford had done. Didn't erase the image of price tags hanging from his family's necks. "Tell me now," Tatanka said, loosening his grip just enough to let Crawford speak. The lieutenant gasped for air, then began talking rapidly, spilling secrets like water from a broken pot. He named names, described locations, revealed the intricate network of corruption that made the slave trade possible. Captain Morrison, at Fort Laramie, was the military coordinator. Judge Pike in Cheyenne provided legal cover. A man named Vincent Walsh ran the actual auctions from a hidden facility in the Black Hills. Crawford talked for nearly an hour, desperate to prove his value, to buy his life with information. When he was finished, Tatanka nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said formally. "You have given me the tools I need to destroy your friends." Crawford's face lit up with hope, believing that his cooperation had saved him. But Tatanka's expression remained cold as winter stone. "However, that does not change what you did to my family. That does not remove the price tags you hung around their necks like they were animals." The knife moved so quickly that Crawford never saw it coming, sliding between his ribs to pierce his heart with surgical precision. The lieutenant died. With a look of surprise on his face, his blood soaking into the papers scattered across his bedroll. Tatanka wiped his knife clean on Crawford's uniform, then began searching through the tent for anything useful. He found more documents, maps showing the locations of hidden camps and safe houses, and a small bag of gold coins that Crawford had earned from his human trafficking. The warrior pocketed the gold and papers, then stepped back to survey his work. Crawford's body lay sprawled across his bedroll, the knife wound barely visible beneath his uniform jacket. To casual observation, it might look like the lieutenant had died of natural causes, perhaps a heart attack brought on by the stress of command. But Tatanka wanted his enemies to know that they were being hunted, wanted them to understand that their crimes would not go unpunished. He reached into his medicine bag and withdrew a small object, a carved bone token that marked him as a member of the Lakota Dog Soldiers, the elite warriors who served as protectors of the people. He placed the token on Crawford's chest directly over the knife wound, then slipped out of the tent as silently as he had entered. The sentries were still at their posts, unaware that their commanding officer was dead, and Tatanka ghosted past them into the darkness beyond the camp. By the time Crawford's body was discovered in the morning, the Lakota warrior would be 50 miles away, already planning his next strike. The ride back to the hidden cave took him through country he had known since childhood, but now it felt different, marked by the knowledge of what was happening to his people throughout the territory. Every ranch they passed might be holding stolen children. Every town might have families that had bought Native Americans as servants or slaves. The comfortable world he had known was revealed as a lie, built on the suffering of his people and protected by the very laws that were supposed to ensure justice. Sakari was waiting for him when he returned, her face showing the strain of worry but also the relief of seeing him alive. Nodin ran to his father, throwing his small arms around the warrior's legs, and for a moment, Tatanka allowed himself to feel the simple joy of being home with his family. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the grim determination that had driven him since he first saw those price tags hanging from their necks. "Is it done?" Sakari asked quietly. Tatanka nodded, then handed her the papers he had taken from Crawford's tent. "The first one is dead," he said. "But there are many more, and they know we're coming now. They'll be more careful, more dangerous." Sakari studied the documents, her face growing pale as she read the names and locations. "So many," she whispered. "How can there be so many?" Tatanka sat beside the fire, suddenly feeling the weight of exhaustion that he had held at bay during the hunt. "Because we trusted them," he said finally. "Because we believed that the treaties meant something, that the white man's law would protect us. We were fools, and our people paid the price for our foolishness." He stared into the flames, seeing the faces of all the children listed in Crawford's ledger, wondering how many of them were still alive, still hoping that someone would come to save them. Nodin looked up from where he was examining his father's war club, his young face serious beyond his years. "What do we do now, father?" he asked. Tatanka reached out and touched his son's head, feeling the soft hair beneath his palm, remembering how the boy had looked standing on that auction block with a price tag around his neck. "Now we hunt them all," he said quietly. "Every last one of them, until our people are free or I am dead." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and outside the cave, the wind carried the sounds of the prairie night. But Tatanka heard something else in that wind, the voices of his ancestors calling for justice, the spirits of murdered children demanding vengeance. Tomorrow he would ride out again, and the next day, and the day after that, until every name in Crawford's ledger was crossed out in blood, because this was more than personal revenge now. This was a war for the soul of his people, a battle against an enemy that had learned to hide behind laws and uniforms and the pretense of civilization. But Tatanka was a dog soldier, trained in the old ways of warfare, and he would show these merchants of human flesh what it meant to face a true warrior of the Lakota nation. The hunt had only just begun. The stench of death hung over Fort Robinson like a curse from the old gods, and Captain Morrison knew that Crawford's murder was just the beginning. The bone token found on the lieutenant's chest had sent shockwaves through the military hierarchy, not because they mourned Crawford's death, but because it meant their lucrative operation was under attack by someone who understood their methods. Morrison stood in his office, staring at the carved token through the glass of a specimen jar, while sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. 3 days had passed since Crawford's body was discovered, and already the careful network they had built was beginning to unravel. 2 civilian contractors had fled the territory overnight, taking their gold and abandoning their posts without explanation. Judge Pike had sent word from Cheyenne that he was suspending all custody transfers indefinitely, claiming a backlog of cases that everyone knew was a lie. Even the traders who handled the actual sales were growing nervous, demanding additional security and higher payments to continue their work. Morrison pulled out a bottle of whiskey from his desk drawer, his hands shaking slightly as he poured himself a drink. He was a career soldier, had fought in the Civil War, and commanded men in battles where death was a constant companion. But there was something different about this threat. This wasn't warfare as he understood it, with armies facing each other across open ground. This was something primal and personal, a force of nature that had been unleashed by their own greed and cruelty. The sound of horses approaching made him look up from his drink. Through the window, he could see a dust cloud moving toward the fort, and as it drew closer, he recognized the distinctive black carriage of Vincent Walsh, the civilian coordinator who ran the actual auction operations. Walsh rarely came to military installations, preferring to conduct his business from the shadows. But Crawford's death had clearly spooked him enough to risk exposure. Walsh entered the office without knocking, his expensive suit dusty from travel and his normally composed demeanor cracked with barely controlled panic. He was a tall man with silver hair and cold blue eyes, the kind of person who could discuss human trafficking with the same detached professionalism that others reserved for livestock or grain futures. But today his mask was slipping, revealing the fear that lurked beneath his civilized exterior. "We have a problem," Walsh said without preamble, dropping into the chair across from Morrison's desk. "Crawford's death wasn't random. Someone is hunting us, someone who knows our operation intimately." Morrison poured another drink and slid it across the desk. "You think it's the warrior? The one whose family Crawford tried to buy?" Walsh drained the whiskey in one gulp, then slammed the glass down on the desk hard enough to crack it. "I know it's him," Walsh said grimly, "and he's not working alone. My sources tell me that Standing Bear, the old scout who sometimes worked for us, has disappeared. 2 of our procurement agents in Nebraska have gone missing, and there are reports of strange symbols being found at abandoned camps throughout the territory." Morrison felt his blood run cold. Standing Bear had been their inside man among the tribes, the one who identified families that could be taken without causing too much trouble. "What kind of symbols?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Walsh reached into his coat and withdrew a piece of paper, unfolding it to reveal a crude sketch of a bone carving. "Dog soldier markers," he said quietly. "The elite warriors of the Lakota Nation. If they're involved, we're not just dealing with one angry father. We're facing a war party that's been trained since childhood to hunt human prey." Morrison stared at the sketch, remembering stories he had heard from other officers about encounters with dog soldiers. They were the stuff of nightmares, warriors who could track a man across hundreds of miles of wilderness, who could slip into fortified camps and kill sentries without making a sound. The army had never been able to defeat them in direct combat, only contain them through superior numbers and firepower. But containment wouldn't work if the dog soldiers were hunting specific individuals. "We need to shut down the operation," Morrison said finally. "At least temporarily, until we can deal with this threat." Walsh shook his head violently. "Impossible. We have contracts to fulfill, buyers who have already paid substantial deposits. Do you have any idea how much money is at stake here? We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more." Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Walsh's face. Even in the face of mortal danger, the man's first concern was profit. "Money won't do us any good if we're dead," Morrison pointed out. "And if the dog soldiers are really after us, death is exactly what we're facing." Walsh stood up and began pacing the small office, his expensive boots clicking on the wooden floor. "Then we hire protection. There are men in this territory who know how to fight Indians, mercenaries who specialize in this kind of work. We can bring in a company of them, set up a defensive perimeter around our operations." Morrison was about to respond when a commotion outside made both men freeze. Shouting voices, the sound of running feet, and then a gunshot that echoed across the fort's parade ground. Morrison grabbed his pistol from the desk drawer and moved to the window, peering out through the glass at the chaos unfolding below. Soldiers were running toward the main gate, their weapons drawn, while officers shouted conflicting orders. "What's happening?" Walsh demanded, his voice tight with fear. Morrison squinted through the dusty glass, trying to make sense of the confusion. "I don't know," he said slowly. "But it looks like someone just rode through our front gate." Another gunshot rang out, followed by the distinctive war cry of a Lakota warrior, and Morrison felt his heart skip a beat. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "He's here." Down in the courtyard, chaos reigned as soldiers scrambled to respond to an attack that had come from nowhere. Tatanka had ridden straight through the fort's main gate at dawn, when the sentries were drowsy and the guards were changing shifts. His war paint gleamed in the morning light as he guided his horse through the maze of buildings, his rifle spitting fire at any soldier who tried to stop him. But he wasn't trying to kill them all, wasn't attempting to take the fort by force. He was sending a message. The warrior rode directly to the center of the parade ground, where a flagpole flew the stars and stripes over the territory. With a fluid motion, he dismounted and began climbing the pole, his movements quick and sure despite the bullets whistling around him. The soldiers below were too shocked to aim properly, their shots going wide as they tried to comprehend what they were seeing. An Indian warrior was desecrating their flag in broad daylight, in the heart of their own fortress. When Tatanka reached the top of the pole, he pulled out a scalping knife and cut the rope that held the American flag. The star-spangled banner fluttered to the ground like a dying bird, and in its place, the warrior tied something that made every soldier in the fort go silent. It was a piece of buckskin painted with symbols that were unmistakable to anyone who knew the old ways. The war paint of a dog soldier on the hunt, but it was what hung below the buckskin that truly terrified the watching soldiers. Dangling from the flagpole like a grotesque banner were dozens of wooden price tags, the same kind that had been used to mark Native American families for sale. Each tag bore a name written in blood, the names of the men responsible for the trafficking operation. Crawford's name was already crossed out, but Morrison could see his own name on one of the tags, along with Walsh's and Judge Pike's and a dozen others. Tatanka slid down the flagpole and remounted his horse in one smooth motion, his eyes scanning the crowd of soldiers who had gathered to watch the spectacle. When his gaze fell on Morrison's office window, the warrior raised his rifle in a mocking salute, then let out another war cry that echoed across the fort like the voice of vengeance itself. A moment later, he was gone, riding back through the gate and disappearing into the prairie beyond. Morrison staggered back from the window, his face pale as death. Walsh was sitting in his chair, staring at nothing, his hands shaking as he tried to process what they had just witnessed. "He knows," Walsh whispered. "He knows everything. Our names, our locations, our methods. How is that possible?" Morrison poured himself another drink, his mind racing as he tried to understand how a single warrior could have penetrated their security so completely. "Crawford must have talked before he died," Morrison said finally. "That's the only explanation. The bastard gave up everything to try to save his own skin." Walsh looked up sharply. "If that's true, then we're all dead men. He knows about the auction house in the Black Hills, about the holding facilities in Nebraska, about the buyers in Denver and St. Louis. Our entire network is compromised." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation, and Morrison called for whoever it was to enter. A young sergeant stepped into the office, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "Sir," he said, saluting crisply, "we've received word from Fort Kearney. 2 men were found dead in their bunks this morning, both with dog soldier tokens on their chests. And sir, there's something else. The water supply has been poisoned with some kind of herb that makes men sick but doesn't kill them. Half the garrison is down with fever and stomach troubles." Morrison felt the walls closing in around him. The warrior wasn't just picking off individual targets, he was systematically destroying their entire operation. "What about the holding facility at Pine Ridge?" he asked. The sergeant's face grew even paler. "Burned to the ground last night, sir. All the prisoners were freed, and the guards were found tied to trees with their uniforms stripped off. Number 1 was killed, but they were all marked with war paint and left as warnings." Walsh stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. "I'm leaving," he announced. "I'm taking the next train east, and I'm not coming back. This is over, Morrison. Whatever we build here, it's finished." Morrison grabbed the civilian's arm as he headed for the door. "You can't just run away. We have responsibilities, contracts to fulfill. If we abandon the operation now, we'll lose. Everything we've worked for. Better to lose money than to lose our lives, Walsh replied, shaking off Morrison's grip. That warrior has declared war on us and he's winning. Look at what he's accomplished in just 3 days. Crawford is dead. 2 facilities have been destroyed, and now he's marked us all for death. How long do you think it will be before he comes for us personally? Morrison wanted to argue, but the truth was undeniable. Their carefully constructed network was crumbling, and there seemed to be no way to stop it. After Walsh left, Morrison sat alone in his office, staring at the price tags that still hung from the flagpole outside his window. Each one represented a life they had stolen, a family they had destroyed, a child they had sold into slavery. For the first time since the operation began, he allowed himself to think about what they had really been doing, the human cost of their greed and ambition. The sound of hoofbeats made him look up again, and he saw a group of riders approaching the fort. But these weren't soldiers or traders. They were Lakota warriors, their faces painted for war, their weapons gleaming in the afternoon sun. At their head rode Tatanka, his massive frame unmistakable even at a distance, and behind him came men whose very presence radiated danger. Morrison counted at least 20 warriors, all of them moving with the controlled precision of elite fighters. They stopped just outside rifle range of the fort's walls, forming a line that stretched across the prairie like a challenge. Tatanka rode forward alone, close enough that his voice would carry to the watching soldiers, and when he spoke, his words cut through the air like a blade. "Hear me, Morrison." The warrior called out. "Your friend Crawford died like a coward, begging for his life and betraying his companions. But I gave him an honorable death, quick and clean. You will not be so fortunate." The captain felt sweat running down his back. "Despite the cool air, you have stolen our children and sold them like animals. You have put price tags on the necks of our families and laughed while you counted your blood money. Now you will pay the price for your crimes." The warriors raised their weapons in a synchronized gesture that was both beautiful and terrifying. "We are the dog soldiers of the Lakota Nation," Tatanka continued. "We are the ones who hunt the hunters, who protect the innocent, who bring justice to those who think themselves above the law. You have 3 days to release every Native American you hold captive, to return every stolen child to their families, and to surrender yourselves for judgment. If you do not, we will come for you, and we will show you what it means to be prey." With that, the warriors wheeled their horses and rode away, disappearing into the vast expanse of the prairie as suddenly as they had appeared. Morrison stood at his window, watching them go, and knew that his world had changed forever. The comfortable certainties of military life, the protection of rank and uniform, the assumption that might made right, all of it was crumbling around him. That night, Morrison sat in his office with a bottle of whiskey and a loaded pistol, waiting for dawn and wondering if he would live to see another sunset. Outside, the fort was silent except for the nervous footsteps of sentries who jumped at every shadow, every sound. The price tag still hung from the flagpole, swaying in the night breeze like the ghostly remnants of their crimes. And somewhere out there in the darkness, Tatanka and his dog soldiers were preparing for war. Judge Harrison Pike had built his reputation on the principle that justice was blind, but as he sat in his chambers in Cheyenne reviewing the latest batch of custody transfer documents, he knew that blindness was exactly what had allowed him to profit from the systematic destruction of Native American families. The ornate mahogany desk before him was covered with legal papers that transformed kidnapping into adoption, slavery into guardianship, and human trafficking into charitable work. Each document bore his official seal, his signature, and his complicity. In crimes that would have horrified him in his younger, more idealistic days, the 3 days that Tatanka had given them were nearly up, and Pike could feel the weight of impending doom settling over the territorial capital like a funeral shroud. Reports had been flooding in from across the region. The auction house in the Black Hills had been reduced to ashes, its guards found tied to trees with symbols carved into their foreheads. The holding facility near Fort Kearny had been liberated, its 43 prisoners freed, and its operators left naked and branded with hot irons. Most terrifying of all, Vincent Walsh had been found dead in his hotel room in Denver, his body arranged in a ritualistic manner that suggested he had died slowly and painfully. Pike reached for the bottle of laudanum he kept in his desk drawer, his hands trembling as he measured out a dose that would calm his nerves without clouding his judgment. He had been using the opium-based tincture more frequently in recent weeks, finding that it was the only thing that allowed him to sleep without. Seeing the faces of the children he had condemned to lives of servitude. The drug dulled the edge of his conscience, but it couldn't eliminate the growing certainty that his past was about to catch up with him. A knock at his chamber door made him jump, nearly spilling the laudanum across his papers. "Enter," he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. His clerk, a nervous young man named Timothy Walsh, stepped into the room with a telegram in his hand. The boy's face was pale, and Pike noticed that his fingers were shaking as he held out the message. "This just arrived from Fort Robinson, Your Honor," Timothy said quietly. "I think you should read it immediately." Pike tore open the telegram. With more force than necessary, his eyes scanning the brief message with growing horror. "Morrison dead. Fort abandoned. Dog soldiers control territory. Recommend immediate evacuation. Colonel Whitman." The words seemed to blur together as Pike read them again, trying to process the implications. Morrison had been the military coordinator for their entire operation, the man who provided the muscle and official sanction that made their activities possible. If he was dead, then their network was truly broken. "Timothy," Pike said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want you to pack all the essential documents and prepare for immediate departure. We're leaving Cheyenne tonight." The young clerk's eyes widened in surprise. "But Your Honor, you have court sessions scheduled for the rest of the week. The territorial legislature is expecting your presence at the budget hearings. You can't just disappear without explanation." Pike stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair in his haste. "The budget hearings won't matter if we're dead, boy. Those savages have declared war on everyone involved in the custody transfer program, and they're systematically hunting down every person who participated. Do you understand what that means? They're not just coming for the soldiers and the traitors. They're coming for anyone who helped make their operation legal." Timothy's face went white as the implications sank in. The boy had been Pike's clerk. For 2 years, had helped prepare dozens of the fraudulent custody documents, had witnessed the meetings where bribes were paid and children's fates were decided. He was as guilty as any of them, and now that guilt was about to become a death sentence. "What should I tell the other court officials?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Tell them nothing," Pike replied, already moving toward the safe, where he kept his most important papers. "Pack only what you can carry, take enough money to get you back east, and pray that distance will protect you from what's coming." He spun the combination lock with practiced ease, his fingers finding the familiar sequence even as his mind raced with plans for escape. Inside the safe were deeds to properties in New York, bank drafts that could be converted to cash, and documents that would allow him to assume a new identity if necessary. As Pike stuffed papers into a leather satchel, he found himself thinking about the chain of events that had led him to this moment. It had started innocently enough, with a simple request from Captain Morrison to expedite the paperwork for a military adoption. A soldier wanted to provide a home for an orphaned Indian child, and the bureaucracy was moving too slowly. Pike had bent the rules slightly, approved the transfer without the usual waiting period, and accepted a small fee for his trouble. But that first compromise had led to others, each one easier to justify than the last. Soon he was approving dozens of adoptions per month, asking fewer questions about the prospective parents, accepting larger fees for his services. The children were going to better lives, he told himself. They were being rescued from poverty and violence, given opportunities they would never have had on the reservations. It was a kindness, really, a form of salvation wrapped in legal documents. The self-deception had continued even as the operation grew more sophisticated and more obviously criminal. When the first reports of abuse reached his desk, Pike had dismissed them as the complaints of ungrateful savages who couldn't appreciate the civilizing influence of white society. When children began disappearing from their new homes, he had assumed they were running away, returning to the primitive lives they had known before their rescue. He had never allowed himself to consider the possibility that they were being sold again, passed from owner to owner like livestock. A sound from the outer office made Pike freeze, his hand halfway to the safe. It was too early for Timothy to have completed his packing, and too late for any legitimate court business. Heavy footsteps echoed through the building, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Pike drew the small pistol he kept in his desk drawer, his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for whatever was coming. The door to his chambers opened slowly, revealing a figure that made Pike's blood turn to ice. Tatanka stood in the doorway, his massive frame filling the entrance, his war paint gleaming in the lamplight. The warrior's eyes swept the room, taking in the scattered papers, the open safe, the obvious signs of a hasty departure. When his gaze finally settled on Pike, the judge felt as if he were being examined by a predator that had cornered its prey. "Going somewhere, Judge?" Tatanka asked, his voice carrying the quiet menace of distant thunder. Pike raised his pistol with shaking hands, pointing it at the warrior's chest. "Stay back," he warned. "I'm armed, and I'm not afraid to use this weapon." Tatanka stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "You should be afraid," he said calmly. "But not of me." "You should be afraid of what?" "You've done, of the children you've condemned, of the families you've destroyed with your pen and your seal." Pike's finger tightened on the trigger, but something in Tatanka's eyes stopped him from firing. It wasn't fear or anger that he saw there, but something far more unsettling. It was disappointment, the kind of look a teacher might give a student who had failed to live up to their potential. "You were supposed to be a guardian of justice," the warrior continued. "Your people trusted you to protect the innocent, to ensure that the law served the cause of righteousness. Instead, you became a merchant of misery, selling children to the highest bidder." "I was helping them," Pike protested, his voice cracking with strain. "Those children were living in poverty, in squalor. I gave them chances at better lives, opportunities they never would have had otherwise." Tatanka moved closer, his movements fluid and controlled despite his size. "Better lives?" he repeated. "Is that what you call it when an 8-year-old girl is sold to a brothel? When a 10-year-old boy is worked to death in a mine? When families are torn apart so that wealthy men can buy servants who can't complain to the authorities?" The warrior reached into his belt and withdrew a leather pouch, spilling its contents onto Pike's desk. Dozens of small objects scattered across the mahogany surface, and Pike realized with growing horror that they were teeth. Children's teeth, each one bearing marks that suggested violence. "These came from the children you sentenced to better lives," Tatanka said quietly. "I found them in Vincent Walsh's collection, along with other trophies that your buyers like to keep. Would you like to know what happened to the rest of their bodies?" Pike's pistol wavered in his grasp as the full weight of his crimes crashed down upon him. He had told himself that he was saving children, that he was part of a benevolent system that rescued the unfortunate from lives of hardship. But the evidence before him painted a different picture, one of systematic abuse and murder on a scale that defied comprehension. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I swear to you I didn't know what was really happening to them." "You didn't want to know," Tatanka corrected. "You took the money, signed the papers, and closed your eyes to the consequences. That's not ignorance, Judge. That's complicity. The warrior moved around the desk, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm. But ignorance or complicity, the result is the same. Children died because of your actions, families were destroyed because of your greed, and my people suffered because you chose profit over justice. Pike tried to back away, but found himself trapped against the wall behind his desk. The pistol felt impossibly heavy in his hands, and he could see his own reflection in Tatanka's dark eyes, distorted and diminished by guilt and fear. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "I can make restitution, pay reparations to the families. I can use my position to investigate other cases, to ensure that justice is served." "Justice has already been served," Tatanka replied. "The children have been freed, the facilities have been destroyed, and your network has been dismantled. My people are safe from your predations, and that's all that matters." Pike felt a flicker of hope, thinking that perhaps he would be spared after all. But then the warrior reached into his belt again, this time withdrawing a scalping knife whose blade had been blackened with soot. "However," Tatanka continued, "there is still the matter of payment. Blood demands blood, Judge. The spirits of the dead children cry out for vengeance, and I am their instrument." Pike raised his pistol again, his finger squeezing the trigger in desperation. The gun clicked harmlessly, the firing pin striking an empty chamber. In his panic, he had forgotten to load the weapon. Tatanka moved with lightning speed, his hand closing around Pike's throat before the judge could react. The warrior's grip was like iron, cutting off Pike's air supply while his other hand brought the knife to the judge's throat. "You have a choice," Tatanka said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can die quickly and cleanly, as a warrior should, or you can die slowly and painfully, as your victims did. Which will it be?" Pike's vision was beginning to blur from lack of oxygen, but he managed to croak out a single word. Quickly, Tatanka nodded, a gesture that might have been respect or simply acknowledgement. "Then face your death with dignity. Judge, face it knowing that your crimes have been exposed, your network has been destroyed, and your victims have been avenged." The knife moved across Pike's throat in a single precise motion, and the judge's blood spilled across the legal documents that had enabled his crimes. As Pike's body slumped to the floor, Tatanka surveyed the carnage he had wrought. The chamber was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, its steady rhythm marking the passage of time that no longer mattered to the dead judge. The warrior reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew another bone token, placing it on Pike's chest as he had done with all the others, but this time he added something else. From his belt, he took a small leather scroll and unrolled it on the desk, revealing a list of names written in careful script. Some of the names were crossed out in red ink, marking the deaths of Morrison, Crawford, Walsh, and now Pike. But many others remained, scattered across the territory like seeds of corruption that had yet to be harvested. The sound of approaching footsteps made Tatanka look up from the list. Through the window, he could see torches moving through the streets of Cheyenne, and the voices of men organizing search parties. Word of his presence had spread, and the town was mobilizing to defend itself against the savage who had already claimed so many lives. But Tatanka felt no fear, only a grim satisfaction at the knowledge that his work was nearly complete. He rolled up the scroll and tucked it back into his belt, then moved to the window and looked out at the gathering crowd. They were brave men, these townspeople and soldiers, willing to risk their lives to protect their community from a perceived threat. But they didn't understand that he was not their enemy, that he was merely a force of nature, a consequence of their own actions returning to claim its due. The warrior opened the window and stepped out onto the roof, his moccasins silent on the wooden shingles. Behind him, Pike's body grew cold in the lamplight, surrounded by the legal documents that had enabled his crimes. Ahead lay the darkness of the prairie, where his horse waited and his next target slept unaware of the doom that was approaching. As Tatanka disappeared into the night, the town of Cheyenne erupted in chaos. Men shouted orders, women screamed in terror, and children hid in their beds as the reality of their situation became clear. The savage who had been hunting their leaders was among them, moving through their streets like a ghost, striking without warning and vanishing before they could respond. They had thought themselves safe behind their walls and their weapons, but safety was an illusion when justice itself had become their enemy. And somewhere in the darkness, Tatanka smiled grimly as he mounted his horse and rode toward his next destination. The list in his belt still contained names, and the night was far from over. The blood debt would be paid in full before the sun rose again, and his people would finally be free from the nightmare that had haunted them for so long. The hunt continued, relentless and unstoppable, until justice was satisfied and the last of the predators had been eliminated. Colonel Marcus Whitman had commanded soldiers through the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, had seen entire regiments torn apart by cannon fire and cavalry charges, but nothing in his military experience had prepared him for the psychological warfare that Tatanka was waging against the remnants of the trafficking network. The dog soldier had transformed from a grieving father into something far more dangerous, a living embodiment of vengeance that struck without warning and vanished like smoke on the wind. As Whitman stood on the ramparts of Fort Laramie watching the horizon for signs of the approaching storm, he knew that everything he had built was about to come crashing down. The reports had been coming in for weeks now, each one more disturbing than the last. Pike's body had been discovered in his chambers, surrounded by evidence of his crimes and marked with the same bone token that had become Tatanka's calling card. The territorial governor had fled to Washington, claiming urgent business that everyone knew was simple cowardice. 3 more judges had resigned their positions and left the territory, abandoning their posts rather than face the warriors' justice. The entire legal framework that had enabled the trafficking operation was collapsing, and with it, the last vestiges of Whitman's empire. But the colonel wasn't ready to surrender, not yet. He had spent 3 years building this network, had invested his reputation and his fortune in the systematic exploitation of Native American families. The profits had been enormous, funding his lavish lifestyle and his political ambitions, and he wasn't about to let one savage destroy everything he had worked for. If Tatanka wanted a war, then Whitman would give him one, but it would be fought on the colonel's terms, with the full might of the United States Army behind him. Whitman had summoned every available soldier in the territory to Fort Laramie, creating a garrison of nearly 500 men armed with the latest weapons and supported by artillery pieces that could reduce any attacking force to bloody fragments. The fort's walls had been reinforced with additional timber and stone, and the surrounding area had been cleared of cover that might conceal an approaching enemy. Sharpshooters were positioned on every tower and walkway, their rifles trained on the prairie beyond the walls. In addition to the regular soldiers, Whitman had hired a company of civilian mercenaries, men who specialized in fighting Indians, and who had no qualms about using tactics that regular army units might consider dishonorable. These were the dregs of the frontier, killers and scalp hunters who saw Native Americans as nothing more than vermin to be exterminated. Their leader was a man named Jacob Crenshaw, a former Confederate officer who had turned to mercenary work after the war ended, and whose reputation for brutality was legendary throughout the territory. Crenshaw stood beside Whitman on the ramparts, his pale eyes scanning the horizon with the intensity of a hunting wolf. He was a tall man with prematurely gray hair and scars that spoke of countless battles, and his presence seemed to radiate violence like heat from a forge. "How many do you think he'll bring?" Crenshaw asked, his voice carrying the soft drawl of his Georgia origins. "The reports suggest he's gathered quite a following among the tribes." Whitman consulted the intelligence reports that had been trickling in from his remaining contacts in the field. "Anywhere from 50 to 200 warriors," he replied. But numbers don't matter when you're facing disciplined soldiers behind fortified walls. We have superior firepower, superior position, and superior training. This savage may have won some victories through stealth and surprise, but he's about to learn what happens when he faces a real army. Crenshaw smiled, revealing teeth that had been stained yellow by years of tobacco use. I hope you're right, Colonel. But I've fought these dog soldiers before, and they're not like regular Indians. They're smart, they're patient, and they have a way of turning your own strengths against you. Don't underestimate them just because they don't fight like white men. Whitman bristled at the suggestion that he might be underestimating his enemy, but he kept his irritation in check. He needed Crenshaw's expertise, distasteful as the man's methods might be. As the sun began to set over the Wyoming territory, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, a lookout on the fort's highest tower called out a warning. Riders approaching from the north. Looks like a war party. Whitman raised his spyglass and peered through the gathering dusk, his heart racing as he made out the distinctive silhouettes of mounted warriors moving across the prairie. They rode in perfect formation, their lances gleaming in the dying light, their war paint visible even at a distance. At the head of the war party rode Tatanka, his massive frame unmistakable even among the other warriors. He had painted his face with the sacred symbols of his people, and his war bonnet flowed behind him like a banner of defiance. Behind him came the cream of Lakota society, dog soldiers and war chiefs who had put aside their own feuds and rivalries to join him in this final confrontation. These were men who had never been defeated in battle, who had humbled the best cavalry units the army could field, and who now rode to settle a blood debt that had been years in the making. The war party stopped just outside rifle range of the fort, forming a long line that stretched across the prairie like a challenge. Tatanka rode forward alone, his horse prancing with nervous energy, and when he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the distance. Whitman, he called out, his words echoing off the fort's walls. You who built your wealth on the bones of children, who sold my people like cattle in your markets of shame. Come out and face me like a warrior, or hide behind your walls like the coward you are. The colonel felt his face flush with anger at the public challenge, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had no intention of engaging in single combat with a savage, no matter how skilled the warrior might be. I have a better idea, he called back, his voice amplified by a speaking trumpet. Why don't you and your followers surrender now, and I'll promise you a quick death. Continue this foolish resistance, and I'll make sure that every last one of you suffers before you die. Tatanka's laughter rang out across the prairie, a sound that was both bitter and genuinely amused. You think your walls can protect you? From justice, Whitman. You think your soldiers can wash the blood from your hands? I have walked through your finest forts, killed your best officers, and scattered your network like leaves in the wind. What makes you think this place will be any different? The warrior raised his rifle above his head, and immediately the entire war party began to move, not forward in a suicidal charge, but sideways, circling the fort like wolves around a wounded buffalo. Whitman watched the maneuver with growing unease. He had expected a direct assault, something his superior firepower could repel with ease. But this circling movement was something else entirely, a tactical deployment that suggested the Indians had a plan beyond simple frontal attack. What are they doing? He asked Crenshaw, who was studying the enemy movements with professional interest. They're probing for weaknesses, the mercenary replied. Looking for blind spots, testing our responses, learning our capabilities. This isn't going to be a battle, Colonel. It's going to be a siege, and sieges are won by the side with the most patience and the best intelligence. As if to prove his point, a volley of arrows arced high over the fort's walls, not aimed at the defenders, but at the buildings inside the compound. Most of the arrows fell harmlessly into the dirt, but a few struck the wooden structures and began to smolder. Fire arrows, Whitman muttered, realizing the implications. The fort's buildings were largely wooden, and a sustained barrage of incendiary arrows could turn the entire compound into an inferno. He began shouting orders to his men, organizing bucket brigades and positioning soldiers to watch for fires. But even as he coordinated the defense, he could feel the initiative slipping away from him. The siege began in earnest as darkness fell over the prairie. The warriors had vanished into the night, but their presence was felt constantly. Sentries reported movement in the shadows, the sound of digging coming from multiple directions, and the occasional arrow that would appear from nowhere to strike a careless soldier. Sleep became impossible as the defenders waited for attacks that never came, their nerves stretched to the breaking point by the constant tension. On the second day of the siege, Whitman discovered what the Indians had been doing during the night. The water supply to the fort had been poisoned with some kind of bitter herb that caused violent stomach cramps and diarrhea. The ammunition storehouse had been infiltrated, and a significant portion of their gunpowder had been stolen or contaminated. Most disturbingly, several of his men had simply vanished during the night, taken from their posts without any of their companions noticing. Crenshaw found the colonel in his office, poring over maps and reports with the desperate intensity of a man who was running out of options. "They're inside the fort," the mercenary announced without preamble. "That's the only way they could have accomplished everything they've done. Somehow, they've managed to get warriors past our defenses, and they're operating freely within our perimeter." Whitman looked up from his maps, his face haggard with exhaustion and stress. "That's impossible," he protested. "We have guards on every wall, sentries at every gate. How could they possibly get inside without being detected?" Crenshaw smiled grimly, his respect for their enemy growing with each passing hour. "Because they're not trying to get inside. Colonel, they're already here. Some of your men aren't who you think they are." The implications of his words hit Whitman like a physical blow. "You're saying we have infiltrators? That some of my soldiers are actually Indians in disguise?" Crenshaw nodded slowly. "It's the only explanation that makes sense. They've been planning this for months, maybe years. They've studied our methods, learned our routines, and placed their people in positions where they could do the most damage when the time came." Whitman felt his world spinning out of control as he realized the full scope of the deception. The truth was even more devastating than Crenshaw had suggested. 3 of Whitman's most trusted sergeants were actually Lakota warriors who had been living undercover for over a year, carefully building their false identities while gathering intelligence on the trafficking operation. They had been the ones who provided Tatanka with detailed information about the network structure, who had sabotaged the fort's defenses, and who now stood ready to strike from within when the final assault began. As the third night of the siege approached, Whitman made a desperate decision. He would break out of the fort with his most loyal troops, abandoning the fixed defenses that had become a trap rather than a sanctuary. If he could reach the railroad depot at Pine Bluffs, he might be able to escape to the east and rebuild his operation in safer territory. It was a cowardly plan, but it was the only chance he had left. The breakout attempt began at midnight, with Whitman leading a column of 50 mounted soldiers toward the fort's main gate. They had muffled their horses' hooves and painted their faces with soot to avoid detection, but their preparations were meaningless. The Lakota warriors had been waiting for exactly this maneuver, and as the column emerged from the fort, they found themselves surrounded by enemies who had been lying in wait. The battle was brief but savage. Whitman's men were caught in a crossfire that shredded their ranks within minutes, their superior weapons useless in the confusion of close combat. The colonel himself was pulled from his horse by hands that seemed to emerge from the very ground, and he found himself face to face with Tatanka at last. The warrior's paint gleamed in the moonlight, and his eyes held the cold fire of absolute justice. "So," Tatanka said quietly, "the great colonel finally shows his true colors. Running away like a beaten dog, abandoning his men to save his own worthless hide." Whitman tried to draw his pistol, but the warrior's grip was like iron, preventing any movement. You sold my people for money, Whitman. You put price tags on children and counted your profits while families were torn apart. Now you'll pay the price for your greed. But before Tatanka could strike the killing blow, Crenshaw appeared out of the darkness, his own knife gleaming as he lunged toward the warrior's back. The mercenary had been waiting for this moment, planning to eliminate both leaders and claim the bounty that had been placed on Tatanka's head. His blade was inches from the warrior's spine when a rifle shot rang out, and Crenshaw pitched forward into the dirt, his treacherous plan ended by one of his own men. The soldier who had fired the shot stepped into the moonlight, revealing himself to be one of the Lakota infiltrators. "My name is Stands Tall," he said in perfect English, his army uniform incongruous with the war paint on his face. "I have served in your army for 2 years, learning your ways, studying your weaknesses. Tonight, the long deception ends and justice is finally served." Whitman stared at the man in shock, realizing that his entire command structure had been compromised. Tatanka nodded to Stands Tall, then turned his attention back to Whitman. "You see, Colonel, your own men serve justice now. The lies you built your empire on have crumbled, and there's nowhere left to run." The warrior raised his war club, its stone head gleaming in the moonlight, and Whitman closed his eyes as death approached. But instead of the crushing blow he expected, he felt the cold touch of a knife blade against his throat. "Open your eyes, Whitman," Tatanka commanded. "Look at what you've built, what you've destroyed, what you've become." The colonel forced himself to look and saw the fort burning in the distance, its wooden structures consumed by flames that painted the night sky orange and red. His soldiers were fleeing in all directions, their discipline shattered by the revelation that their enemies had been among them all along. The mighty fortress that was supposed to protect him had become his tomb. "This is what justice looks like," Tatanka said softly. "Not the corrupt mockery you dispensed from your courtrooms and offices, but real justice earned through blood and sacrifice. My people are free, their children are safe, and the network that enslaved them is destroyed forever." The knife moved across Whitman's throat in a single precise motion, and the colonel's blood joined that of his victims in the thirsty earth. As the last of the traffickers died, Tatanka looked up at the burning fort and felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The blood debt had been paid, the network had been destroyed, and his people were finally safe from the predators who had hunted them for so long. But victory came with a price, and the warrior knew that the scars of what they had endured would take generations to heal. The surviving soldiers had scattered to the winds, carrying with them the story of the dog soldier who had brought justice to the frontier. Some would call him a savage, others a hero, but all would remember the night when the mighty United States Army was brought low by a father's love and a warrior's code. And in the tribal camps across the territory, children would grow up hearing the legend of Tatanka, the warrior who had fought the white man's greed and won. The hunt was over, but the legend was just beginning. 5 years had passed since the flames of Fort Laramie painted the night sky crimson, and the Dakota Territory bore little resemblance to the lawless frontier that had once harbored the trafficking network. Where corruption had once festered in the shadows of military installations and territorial courts, a new order had emerged, built not on the exploitation of the weak, but on the hard-won respect between peoples, who had learned to see each other as human beings rather than commodities. Tatanka stood on the bluff overlooking the valley where his people had established their new settlement, watching as Lakota children played alongside the sons and daughters of white settlers who had proven themselves worthy of trust. The warrior's hair had begun to show streaks of silver, and the lines around his eyes spoke of the weight he had carried through those dark years of hunting and killing. But there was peace in his expression now, the kind of contentment that came from knowing that his family was safe, his people were free, and the nightmare that had once threatened to consume them all had been transformed into something resembling justice. Sakari approached from behind, her footsteps silent on the grass, and placed her hand on his shoulder with the familiar comfort of a woman who had shared both his darkest moments and his greatest triumphs. The council meeting went well, she said quietly, her voice carrying the satisfaction of work accomplished. The territorial governor has agreed to establish formal treaties with all the tribes in the region, and he's appointed a commission to investigate any remaining cases of missing persons or illegal custody transfers. Standing Bear will serve as the Native American representative, and he has your old friend Agent Torres coming from Washington to oversee the federal involvement. Tatanka nodded, pleased but not surprised by the news. The new territorial administration had learned the hard way that ignoring Native American rights led to consequences that no amount of military force could contain. The transformation had not come easily or without cost. In the immediate aftermath of the network's destruction, there had been chaos as military units scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. Politicians fled the territory to avoid investigation, and federal authorities struggled to understand the scope of the corruption that had been exposed. For a time, it had seemed as though the entire governmental structure of the Dakota Territory might collapse under the weight of the revelations, and there had been serious discussions in Washington about placing the region under direct military rule. But Tatanka had not allowed the vacuum of authority to become an excuse for further violence. Instead of pressing his advantage and driving all white settlers from Lakota lands, he had chosen a different path, one that required more courage than any battle he had ever fought. He had reached out to the few honest officials who remained, the settlers who had played no part in the trafficking, and the military officers whose consciences had been troubled by what they had witnessed. Together, they had begun the slow work of building a new system based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. The first step had been the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a body that included representatives from all the affected tribes as well as territorial officials and federal observers. For 2 years, the commission had heard testimony from survivors of the trafficking network, documented the crimes that had been committed, and worked to reunite families that had been torn apart by the illegal adoptions and sales. It had been painful work, forcing both communities to confront the darkest chapters of their shared history, but it had also been necessary for healing to begin. Nodin came running up the hill, now 13 years old and tall for his age, his face bright with the enthusiasm of youth. The boy had grown into a natural leader among his peers, and Tatanka often saw in him the seeds of the man he would become, someone who would bridge the gap between the old ways and the new world that was emerging around them. "Father," Nodin called out, slightly breathless from his run. "Agent Torres has arrived from the capital, and she wants to speak with you about the new school project." The school project had been Sakari's idea, a revolutionary concept that would bring together children from all the communities in the region regardless of their racial or cultural background. It would teach both traditional Native American wisdom and the academic subjects that would be necessary for success in the changing world, creating a generation that could navigate between cultures without losing their essential identity. The proposal had been controversial on both sides, with some tribal elders fearing the loss of traditional ways and some white settlers objecting to their children learning alongside savages, but Tatanka had thrown his full support behind the initiative. Agent Sarah Torres had proven to be one of the most valuable allies in the effort to rebuild the territory's institutions on a foundation of justice rather than exploitation. She had been among the first federal officials to recognize the scope of the trafficking network, and her investigation had been instrumental in bringing the surviving perpetrators to justice through the legal system rather than through the warrior's blade. More importantly, she had understood that true peace could only come through addressing the root causes of the conflict, rather than simply punishing the symptoms. Tatanka found Torres in the council lodge, studying maps and documents with the intense concentration that had made her one of the most effective investigators in the federal service. She looked up as he entered, her face breaking into a smile that spoke of genuine friendship forged through shared struggle. "Tatanka," she said, rising to greet him with the respect due to an equal, rather than the condescension that had characterized most white officials' interactions with Native Americans. "I have news from Washington that I think you'll find interesting. The territorial status proposal?" Tatanka asked, settling onto the buffalo robe that had been prepared for him. Torres nodded, her excitement barely contained. "Congress has approved the creation of the Dakota-Lakota Territory, with full recognition of tribal sovereignty within designated areas and guaranteed representation in the territorial legislature. It's unprecedented, Tatanka. You've accomplished something that no Native American leader has ever achieved. The creation of a truly integrated governmental structure that respects both cultures." The proposal had been born out of the practical reality that the traditional reservation system had failed to protect Native American rights while also failing to provide the economic opportunities that both communities needed to thrive. Instead of segregation, the new model called for integration with protection, allowing Native Americans to participate fully in the territorial economy and government while maintaining their cultural identity and traditional lands. It was a compromise that satisfied neither the most radical voices on either side, but it offered something more valuable than ideological purity. It offered hope. "There's something else," Torres continued, her expression becoming more serious. "We've received reports from other territories, other states, that similar networks may be operating beyond our borders. The investigation here has inspired victims in other regions to come forward, and the federal government is considering creating a permanent task force to investigate and prosecute these crimes on a national scale. They want you to head it." Tatanka was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of such a responsibility. The work would take him away from his family, would force him to relive the nightmare of hunting predators who traded in human suffering. But it would also give him the opportunity to ensure that what had happened in the Dakota Territory would never happen again, that no other father would have to see price tags hanging from his children's necks. "What would such a position entail?" he asked finally. "You would have the authority to investigate suspected trafficking operations across the entire western frontier," Torres explained. "You'd work with both federal and territorial authorities, coordinate with tribal governments, and have access to resources that would make the old dog soldier operations look like child's play. But more than that, you'd be establishing precedents, creating procedures that would protect Native American families for generations to come." Before Tatanka could respond, a commotion outside the lodge drew their attention. Through the entrance, they could see a group of riders approaching the settlement, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with urgency. The lead rider was standing there, the old scout whose warning had started Tatanka's bloody campaign 5 years earlier, and his expression suggested that the news he carried was not welcome. Standing Bear dismounted and entered the lodge without the usual courtesies, his aged face tight with worry. "There are children missing," he announced without a preamble. 12 families from the Crow Reservation, all taken in the last month. The authorities are calling it a rash of runaways, but the pattern is too familiar. Someone is using the old methods, the old networks. Tatanka felt his blood turn cold as the implications sank in. Despite all their efforts, despite the destruction of Whitman's organization and the reforms that had followed, the evil they had fought was rising again. How is that possible? Torres demanded. "We dismantled the entire network, arrested everyone involved, destroyed all their facilities. How could they be operating again so quickly?" Standing Bear's expression was grim as he pulled out a leather pouch and spilled its contents onto the ground. Wooden price tags scattered across the buffalo robe, each one bearing a child's name and a dollar amount, just like the ones that had hung from Sakari and Nodin's necks 5 years earlier. "Because we cut off the head of the snake, but we didn't kill the body," Standing Bear replied. "The buyers are still out there, the demand still exists, and there are always men willing to supply what people will pay for." The organization was destroyed, but the market that created it never went away. Tatanka studied the price tags, feeling the familiar rage building in his chest like a storm gathering on the horizon. "Where?" he asked, his voice carrying the quiet menace that had once terrified corrupt officials throughout the territory. Standing Bear spread out a map, marking locations with pieces of charcoal. The children were all taken from isolated areas near the reservation boundaries. Places where federal authority is weak and tribal jurisdiction is unclear. The kidnappers are avoiding the main settlements, sticking to the gaps in our coverage, where they can operate without being detected. Torres was already reaching for her saddlebags, pulling out the official documents that would give her the authority to investigate across territorial boundaries. "I can have federal marshals at these locations within a week," she said. "We can coordinate with the tribal police, establish search parties, put pressure on the local authorities to cooperate." But Tatanka was already shaking his head, understanding. "Better than the federal agent what they were really facing. By the time your marshals arrive, the children will be gone," he said quietly. "Sold, transported, disappeared into the same network that we thought we had destroyed. The people behind this learned from Whitman's mistakes. They're more careful now, more decentralized, harder to track." He stood up, his decision already made despite the pain it would cause his family. "There's only one way to stop them, and it's the same way we stopped them before." Sakari had been listening from outside the lodge, and now she entered with Nodin close behind her. Both of them understood what Tatanka's words meant, what choice he was facing. "You're going to hunt them again," Sakari said, not as a question but as a statement of inevitable fact. Tatanka reached out and took her hand, feeling the strength that had sustained him through the darkest days of their ordeal. "I have to," he replied simply. "Those children are depending on someone to come for them, just as you and Nodin depended on me. I can't abandon them to the same fate we escaped." Nodin stepped forward, his young face set with determination that reminded Tatanka powerfully of himself at that age. "Then I'm coming with you, father. I'm old enough now, and I've been training with the other warriors. It's time for me to take my place in the fight." Tatanka looked at his son, seeing the boy he had been and the man he was becoming, and felt a complex mixture of pride and fear. Nodin had the right to choose his own path, had earned the opportunity to stand beside his father as an equal rather than a protected child. But the work ahead would be dangerous, would require sacrifices that no parent wanted to ask of their child. "Are you certain?" Tatanka asked. "Once we begin this hunt, there will be no going back. The men we're chasing will show no mercy if they capture us." "They showed no mercy to the children they stole," Nodin replied, his voice carrying an echo of his father's implacable determination. "They put price tags on families, sold human beings like livestock, destroyed lives for profit. Someone has to stop them, father, and if that someone is us, then I want to be part of it." Tatanka nodded slowly, recognizing the moment when a boy became a warrior, when the next generation took up the burden of protecting the innocent. As the sun set over the Dakota territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Tatanka stood with his family and allies, preparing for a new campaign against an old enemy. The trafficking network had risen from the ashes of its destruction, but it would face a different opponent this time, one tempered by experience and strengthened by the knowledge that justice was possible even in the darkest circumstances. The hunt would begin again at dawn, father and son riding together into the vast expanse of the frontier, carrying with them the hopes of families who refused to accept that their children were lost forever. Behind them, the settlement continued its work of building a better world, one where cooperation replaced exploitation and understanding replaced hatred. Ahead lay the dangerous path of the hunter, the blood-soaked trail that led through violence to peace, through darkness to light. But Tatanka no longer walked that path alone, and that knowledge gave him strength for the battles yet to come. The storm had passed, but its legacy lived on in the hearts of those who remembered that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.